If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager, then, without hesitation, that he is.
Think about it, Blaise Pascal asks. If there is no God, whether you believe in him or not, you stand to lose merely finite pleasures. 10 minutes of grovelling here and there, getting up early on a Sunday, and once in a while nodding along to a quite frankly terrifying sermon.
Oh, in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him also shall the Son of Man be ashamed.
But if there is a God, and you believe in him, you stand to gain infinite pleasure, heaven, and avoid infinite suffering, hell. Given this, Pascal argues, you ought to wager that God exists. That, my fellow apes, is Pascal's wager, and this is the first in a series titled Objections to Pascal's Wager. Now you might be thinking, Steve, bro, you've already covered this argument. You're beating a dead horse. Why not make a series on logical fallacies, for example? In reply I say, yes, you're right, and in time I will make that series. But before doing so, I'm going to revisit my roots, but this time rip them entirely from the ground. I want to remaster, expand, and energise my older videos, and in the process make the series that my younger self so craved. At least, that's the plan. Hence, over the next few months, I'm going to dedicate a series to each of the major arguments for theism, in which I delve deeply into the objections and defences given. With that, I'm Stephen Woodford, thank you for joining me, and this is all on God. Arguments and proofs of God, such as William Paley's watchmaker analogy and Al-Kindi's Kalam cosmological argument.
Al-Ghazali.
No, Craig, it's Al-Kindi's, but that's for another time. As I was saying, most theistic arguments purport to straight up prove the existence of God, but Pascal's wager is different. Rather than arguing for the existence of God, it argues for belief in God. Now granted, many proponents wield the wager as if it does prove the existence of God, but Pascal certainly didn't, and it's important that we acknowledge this to accurately present and hopefully stillman the argument. Talking of which, we'll get to the argument soon enough, but first, let's meet the quite frankly brilliant man behind it, Blaise Pascal. Born in Clermont-Ferrand, is that how it's pronounced?
Clermont-Ferrand.
Bloody French. Born in France, Pascal was a child prodigy who displayed a particular aptitude for mathematics. Impressively, by the age of just 16, he published what is now known as Pascal's theorem, which was so precocious that even René Descartes was convinced that Pascal's father must have written it. And by the age of 19, Pascal had invented a calculator capable of addition and subtraction, establishing him as one of two inventors of the mechanical calculator. Truly, this kid was smart. Unfortunately, however, he suffered from illness most of his life and died at the age of just 39 from, we speculate, either tuberculosis or stomach cancer. What didn't help is that he frequently rejected medical attention because he believed, quote, sickness is the natural state of Christians. And so yeah, Pascal went full-blown Mother Teresa and as a result likely earned himself a Darwin Award. Or one could put it this way, he chose suffering over medical science.
I'm about to end this man's whole career.
Anyhow, to get inside the mind of Pascal and truly understand his argument, I've digested several times several chapters of his posthumously published work that it's derived from, titled Thoughts. And while I still maintain that the man was mathematically brilliant, I find his theological work to be simply insufferable. It's logically weak, despite being written as if it's ironclad. It's so mired in fear of God and death that it reads like a Freudian wet dream, and it incessantly misrepresents and mocks atheists. In fact, why should I suffer alone? Here's a taster, don't you dare skip.
There are only three kinds of persons. Those who serve God, having found him, others who are occupied in seeking him, not having found him, while the remainder live without seeking him, and without having found him. The first are reasonable and happy. The last are foolish and unhappy. Those between are unhappy and reasonable.
Great stuff, isn't it? you unhappy, unreasonable fools.
Begin by pitying unbelievers. They are wretched enough by their condition. It is a great evil thus to be endowed.
Yeah, take that pity, you wretched infidels. Okay, no more suffering. Let's move on and...
Psych!
Cure yourself of unbelief and ask the remedy for it. Learn of those who have been bound like you and who now stake all the possessions. These are the people who know the way which you would follow and who are cured of an ill of which you would be cured.
Okay, seriously this time, we're done. As I hope I've made clear, I don't recommend that you read his theological work. But in case, like Pascal, you'd like to choose suffering over joy, I've left the link in the description. Now let's get to the argument already. While Pascal's wager can be presented formally, it's most often done so informally through the question of, what if you're wrong?
What if you're wrong, knowing how the Christians believe what the consequences really are?
And when the wager is wielded by laymen, such as the countless horde that call into the atheist experience, and your almost impressively self-righteous aunt, it tends to be trivially weak. But when the wager is wielded by a great philosopher, it tends to be substantially stronger. Though, that being said, you should know that such philosophers are very rarely convinced by it, and for many great reasons. Anyhow, when presented formally, the wager is typically done so through a decision matrix rather than a syllogism, and so that's what we'll primarily do here. In section 3 of Thoughts, under the title Off the Necessity of the Wager, Pascal presents his argument several times, but does so most directly towards the end, stating,
If there is a God, he is infinitely incomprehensible, since, having neither part nor limits, he has no affinity to us. We are then incapable of knowing either what he is, or if he is. This being so, who will dare to undertake the decision of that question? Not we, who have no affinity to him.
And so here we have the first premise, that being that God is utterly incomprehensible. We can't know anything about him. Now most proponents of the wager forego this premise. They don't include it, and it's because 1, the wager works perfectly fine without it, and 2, the premise is extremely problematic. Pascal, however, incessantly emphasizes this premise throughout his presentation, and so in respect to this, I'll dedicate the entire next episode to it. For now, however, and this premise aside, here's the argument.
God is, or he is not. But to which side shall we incline?
Here, Pascal gives us a dichotomy in the form of 2 rows. God exists or God does not exist. That is, P or not P. He continues.
There's an infinite chaos which separated us. A game is being played at the extremity of this infinite distance where heads or tails will turn up. What will you wager?
And thus he gives us another dichotomy in the form of 2 columns, belief in God and no belief in God. And he asks us to place our bet. Which will you wager? Now you might be thinking, as Pascal preempts, that the true course is not to wager at all, but Pascal responds,
But you must wager. It is not optional. You are embarked. Which will you choose then?
and in doing so he gives us a 4th premise. We must wager. We can't walk away from the table. At the time of our death, we will either believe that God exists or we will not. It is that simple. And finally, with the groundwork in place, Pascal gives us the crux of the argument.
Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these 2 chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager, then, without hesitation, that he is.
Pascal churns over this reasoning several times over, and know that we will too in subsequent videos. But simply put, that's the argument. The matrix is complete.
Welcome to the desert of the real.
We have 4 outcomes, and each has an expected utility. Now, since the worst outcome associated with wagering that God does exist is negligible to the best outcome associated with wagering that God does not exist, the former simply superdominates the latter. It is objectively better to wager that God exists. Let's break it down. If you wager that God does not exist, at best you will have experienced finite pleasure, such as laying in on a Sunday. But at worst, you will come to experience infinite suffering, hell. And just like he who shall not be named, since thou shalt not blaspheme against the monetization gods, you'll receive a pineapple a day. But if you wager that God does exist, at worst you will have foregone finite pleasures, such as that lay-in, and at best you will come to experience infinite pleasures, heaven. You will stand at the pearly gates, clutching an all-inclusive, infinite stay at God's Grand Hotel. Now crucially, since the finite is annihilated in the presence of the infinite, and that both infinities are associated with God existing, the rational bet, indeed the only bet that stands to reason, stands before you. Wager, then, without hesitation, that he is. Over the centuries, there have been many objections levied at and defences given for Pascal's wager, and within this series I'm going to engage with the most influential and compelling. Talking of which, if you're watching this through the playlist, at the end of this video the first objection will play automatically. But if you're not in the playlist, you can find a link to it in the description or comment section. Anyhow, I'm Stephen Woodford, and as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via other means. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for enabling me to fight the good fight against religion, superstition, and pseudoscience. Together, we are making a difference.